You're listening to the Nutrition Experts Podcast, featuring guests who take the scientific talk about food and break it down for practical use. You've heard the phrase, "You are what you eat." Come find out what that really means. Experience conversations with experts in the field of nutrition and understand the power of food for our health, well-being, and beyond. Now, here's your host, registered dietitian and nutritionist, Mathea Ford.
Hi there, it's Mathea. Welcome back to the Nutrition Experts Podcast. The podcast featuring nutrition experts who are leading the way using food starts today, right now, with our next guest. It's great to have Bethany Frazier on the show today. Bethany, welcome to Nutrition Experts.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you on the show and share your expertise with my tribe. So Bethany, let's start out with letting you tell my listeners a little more about you and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a private practice dietitian. I've been a registered dietitian. Last week was actually 5 years. I have a private practice in Kansas City. I mostly deal with probably about 75% of the patients that I see are for gut health problems. And then I also do some consulting work. I have 2 children. I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. So when I'm not working, or while I'm working, maybe sometimes too, I'm busy chasing them around. That's the little snippet of my life in Kansas City.
I'm so excited to talk to you today because you mentioned you talk about gut health. What do you mean when you say gut health?
Well, that's a pretty loaded question. There's a lot. It seems like you just type in gut health, or you just are scrolling through your Facebook feed, your Instagram feed, and there's going to be someone telling you to do something about gut health. I think it's because it's changing so quickly, and we're realizing that a lot of what we do can influence our gut health and just how we feel in general. So gut health can be everything from the actual bacteria that's present in our gut. So a lot of people think of probiotics, all the way to actually how your gut functions. So the amount of acid that's in it, how your stomach contracts appropriately, or your stomach and your intestines contract. And then the symptoms are usually what people know. So anything from your mouth down, from reflux or heartburn, stomach pain, bloating, gas, diarrhea, constipation, all those fun things that we see on the infomercials, it seems like.
When people come to you, what are their typical things that they're wanting to see you for? Does their doctor refer them? Do they find you?
I think I see a pretty healthy mix of both. It's not uncommon. Most people will have at least been to their doctor and have tried to get some idea of what they should do to improve their symptoms. I usually tell people, because people will come to me in desperation, and that's usually what happens. People don't come to me because, from a gut health standpoint, they don't come to me because they want to prevent it. Usually they're coming to me because they've tried everything else. They've Googled every answer and nothing is working. So they're at that point where they need an expert and they need an intervention now. So sometimes doctors will refer to me as well. I have a couple of practitioners that I work with in Kansas City that will refer on to me, knowing that I can help their patients. Because doctors also are now realizing that a lot of our symptoms can be at least helped, sometimes alleviated, sometimes completely improved, or balanced out with medications that they're recommending through the diet, but they often don't have time, and they don't sometimes have the specifics on what to do. So sometimes the doctor will refer them on. Sometimes the patient will say, I went to the doctor and they pretty much said, just help your symptoms along. And they didn't give me any other resources, but I'm trying to help my symptoms, and I think that can help. So sometimes they're their own advocate. It just kind of all across the board that they'll end up at my doorstep saying, I need help. How can I feel better?
So is that something that you would refer to in general as like irritable bowel, what people are coming to see you for, or is that in general what you work with? I
occasionally will see some patients that have more of a definitive diagnosis. So like IBD would be Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. So sometimes we'll see patients like that. Sometimes I'll see patients that have like GERD or reflux, one of those, gastritis. But IBS is pretty common. It is an actual diagnosis. If you probably talk to any of your friends, they're like, oh, I have IBS or irritable bowel syndrome. But it's really estimated that about 12% of the population worldwide actually has a diagnosed version of IBS. And there's a couple criteria that physicians or experts will use to diagnose IBS. So I can't diagnose as a dietitian IBS, but patients will come to me. Either they've diagnosed themselves But the actual criteria for being diagnosed with IBS is that you have to have it's pain or discomfort 1 day per week over the last 3 months. And then, so that's the overarching umbrella. And then you have to have 2 out of these 3 symptoms, which are pain during a bowel movement, a change in your stool frequency, or a change in the appearance of your stool. So at least 2 out of those 3 things is be classified as an actual diagnosis of IBS.
People who come to you and say, I have IBS, or I think I have IBS, if they haven't been diagnosed, what are the symptoms that they're experiencing?
Anything across the board. I've had everything from people who have headaches or fatigue to bloating. Because people usually come to me when they're in dire straits, that they haven't, nothing else has worked. Usually they have at least one bowel problem. So either they've had an increase in frequency, they went from being every other day to multiple times a day, or sometimes the opposite. They went from being once or twice a day to once a week. So flipping back and forth between those. Sometimes it's cycling back and forth between diarrhea and constipation. Sometimes it'll just be bloating after they have a meal. That's where I think people will start to realize, oh, what I'm eating might be impacting my bowel habits, because they will say, I ate something and then I bloated, but I researched it and I can't figure out what it is. I've taken out all of the foods that I can think of it could possibly be. I eat really healthy, all of those criteria. They'll say I did it myself and I'm still having this bloating after I eat, or I'm having reflux sometimes after I eat. And sometimes pain will be another symptom that people often will say. So pain either in their stomach, anywhere along, cramping along their intestines, sometimes they'll say as well. And usually it's influencing their life. So it's making them stay in bed. Maybe it's making them not fearing being away from a toilet. So they need to be close at all times, which can definitely influence your life and the choices that you make, whether you're able to travel, whether you're able to go to kids' baseball games when there's no bathroom close. So usually it's impeded in their life enough that they're saying, I can't go on with this. And there's plenty of people who are living with probably mild symptoms. I think usually what I tell people is that over the course of about 10 years is when your symptoms develop. Sometimes it's one thing that really sets it off. You'll get, it's often that you'll have either hormonal fluctuation, or you'll have an event that happens. You get the stomach bug, you get maybe food poisoning, something like that totally shifts. And then all of a sudden you're like, I just can't bounce back from this. I don't know what's wrong with me. That's usually we can point to some or a very stressful occurrence that they just can't bounce back from. And then, so that's not uncommon that's where it will start. But usually people who are more in the gradual, that they have slowly developed those problems over about 10 years, where they almost think, I can't remember the last time I had a regular bowel movement. So they don't think about it until it becomes very problematic.
So IBS is not the same as, you said, Crohn's. Is there celiac? All that? It's completely different.
It's different. It's not completely separate in the treatment we would do of it. And so celiac is actually an autoimmune disease, and so is the IBD categories, the Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. So they have that immune function. Celiac, as most people know, cannot have any gluten in their diet. And IBS patients often will do in the elimination, and even with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, because the gluten can be inflammatory for some people. It's not for everyone, but it can be inflammatory for some people. So that can transpose all of those categories that we're talking about, removing gluten. But for people that have IBS, it's not always gluten that's going to be the trigger for them, or wheat that's going to be the trigger for them. So you have to be cautious in that, because you want to make sure that you're having good nutritional diversity. And that's challenging. With someone that has celiac, often, if that's their only symptom, they can have complete symptom resolved just by maintaining a gluten-free diet. There are times where they have to have a couple extra layers, and that's where you might implement some of the other IBS-related interventions, which would be appropriate for people in ulcerative colitis or Crohn's. They sometimes will use the same interventions for dietary interventions for managing IBS, not when they're in their flares, but during their kind of day-to-day life, they might use some of the other dietary things that IBS patients will try and implement.
So Bethany, what are the general recommendations for people with IBS? What type of treatment do you usually do with them?
It depends on the patient. So if they've gone to see their doctor, then sometimes they're on medications that are supposed to alleviate their symptoms. Everything from an antidepressant, because they're trying to manage that gut sprain, to an antibiotic. That's often, especially if they're suspecting maybe of SIBO or that small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So that might be an intervention that a patient might come to me on. Sometimes their doctors have tried to do some just symptom management. So diarrhea, just take an Imodium or something like that. Or they might come with like a laxative for constipation, those types of things. It's often that they'll come in with those on. Sometimes their doctors will even recommend something like get rid of all your dairy and your wheat, do some sort of elimination diet. And with my patients, depending on what their symptoms are that they present in, so it's really specific to the patient, but I find that probably close to, totally anecdotally, but I feel like close to 75% of the patients that I see that have IBS will respond really positively to the low FODMAP diet. And so that's usually I do some variation in that. I'll even have patients that are referred to me because they have fructose sensitivity, which is can cause some of it. IBS, the diagnosis is actually a rule-out diagnosis. So that means they've tried everything else and you don't test positive on there's no other reason you are having these symptoms. And one of those rule-out diagnoses is fructose malabsorption. And so they can test for that and they can say, yes, you have it, or no, you don't. And so sometimes people won't have got all the way to the IBS diagnosis because they have fructose malabsorption. So similar criteria will say, can you alleviate all your symptoms with removing fructose from your diet or limiting fructose in your diet? And if they can't, then we might edge them towards the FODMAP diet to see or low FODMAP diet to see if that will alleviate their symptoms. So there's lots of, that's a little bit more restrictive. So people that can not be on quite as restrictive a diet, we might just adjust. So if there's someone that has lots of constipation, we might talk about increasing their water or decreasing their caffeine, having more fiber in their diet consistently, and seeing if that alleviates the symptoms. Of course, we don't want them on a restrictive diet, any sort of restrictive diet long-term if they don't have to be. So my goal is always to try and find the least restrictive version of a diet that they can follow to alleviate their symptoms, get potentially some of the inflammation down so that we can really see what the root cause of why they're having these symptoms and how we can prevent them long-term.
I totally agree with you there about the least restrictive diet. People come and talk to me about kidney disease and they're like, I cut out potassium and phosphorus. And I'm like, did your doctor tell you had to do that? So, because I'm like, that's just making it more complicated if you start simple. So you did mention a low FODMAP diet. And for our listeners, what does FODMAP stand for and what is it?
So the low FODMAP diet is actually based off carbohydrates that are in the foods that we eat and fibers that are either poorly digested or slowly digested and can cause symptoms. So they're small and they can cause extra water to be pulled into your gut. And the FODMAP stands for fermentable or non-fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. What letter was I missing? So those are just fancy terms for carbohydrates, basically. So oligosaccharides would be things like wheat, onion, garlic. The disaccharides, the most popular one is lactose. About 70% of people actually have difficulty digesting lactose, which is in the sugar that's in milk. Monosaccharides, one that we usually are concerned about is fructose. I already mentioned fructose malabsorption. So this pulls actually extra water into the gut. And it's really not too much of a problem for some of our fruits. This is the fruit sugar, as long as it has equal parts with glucose and another sugar. But some things that fructose would be in would be things like honey. That's a popular culprit, especially for people that think they're eating really healthy. They'll say, I eat really healthy. They're subbing out their regular table sugar for honey, and that's higher in fructose. High fructose corn syrup obviously is high in fructose. You can guess that by the name. Apples, pears, mangoes are some popular fruits that are also really high in fructose. And then polyols are sugar alcohols, which could be artificially in things like mints or gum. If someone's chewing a lot of mints or gum, especially if they're having symptoms, they often will think, oh, I feel a little bit better when I have a sugar-free mint. And that can be actually making their symptoms worse. And then the two naturally occurring are sorbitol and mannitol, which are in our stone fruits like peaches and plums. And then cauliflower is another one. So you can see that a lot of the foods that are in these different categories are healthy foods that we should include in our diet on a regular basis, like our fruits and our vegetables. And even like garlic is touted for helping with heart disease. So things like that we're spread that message, but it can be very problematic for people that struggle in this IBS category because the belief, no one really knows. I don't think that they have a complete idea, at least. I don't have a complete idea. But they think that people that struggle with these FODMAP foods, it's not necessarily that they are absorbing them differently. Sometimes it is. It's usually their sensitivity to that. So most people, if they eat these foods, they're actually going to respond because they're slowly digested. But these people are sensitive to that sensation and it causes them problems. So it's all that connection of how your body is working all together to cause you actually worse symptoms.
How do you do the low FODMAP diet with someone? Do you just eliminate everything at the beginning and then add them back a little bit to see how people respond, or how does that go?
The low FODMAP diet is not meant to be a permanent diet because it's so restrictive. So our goal is to get you back to the least restrictive version. There might be a couple trigger foods or trigger categories, but for most people, I find they might respond to one category, but they're going to be able to have most of the foods. It's usually a layering effect, having too much in one day. We don't know that until we've removed them from your diet. So usually what I do is I require at least 10 days of you following a pretty strict elimination diet that doesn't have any or very few FODMAPs in it. And I say 10 days just because I feel like people are more compliant when it's just 10 days. Some experts will say up to 6 weeks. If at 10 days they are not improving, I want to know so that I can move them on to a different intervention. But if at 10 days they're improving, then we can continue on a little bit longer until their symptoms are mostly managed. And then we can start systematically reintroducing the foods and seeing what their responses are. So the goal is to see which foods they're responding to negatively and be able to pinpoint those so that they can understand those foods are probably going to be problematic for them in the long run, but get them also the best case scenario. After we're done, we usually do some sort of gut healing to make sure that inflammation is reduced and they can move forward and not feel like they have to be on this restrictive diet forever.
It probably takes a lot of work and intervention for them to kind of get those things out. But then do you find most people at the beginning of that, at least after those 10 days, they've got relief from their symptoms and they're able to clearly identify by adding them back in what is causing the problems?
Usually. So it's a kind of a long process, or it can be a long process because we want to really identify those things. But usually people can help to identify which foods are problematic. And if they have a little bit, sometimes it's too much of a layering effect. So some of the foods that are okay on the low FODMAP list or elimination diet actually have a little bit. So someone who says, I'm going to go, or they accidentally buy the wrong peanut butter that has high fructose corn syrup in it, or they're having too much sugar, because sugar is allowed, but too much sugar, not necessarily a FODMAP, but can cause problems for our gut. So sometimes, or a lot of extra stress, they're traveling for work and they don't know exactly what's in their food, or they're just stressed in general, they're not sleeping enough. So there's lots of different factors that we're trying to evaluate to see why they're responding to these foods. But I find that in general, most people by the end of the process have their symptoms pretty well under control and can manage them from a low FODMAP standpoint to be able to move forward and kind of make some of those adjustments to their diet that aren't going to be life altering.
So if somebody's maybe got a little bit of a problem with their stomach, or they're constipated, or they're having diarrhea, but they're not necessarily to the level of IBS, are there some general guides that you tell people to have good gut health, foods that they should eat, ways they should eat that would help them to just possibly improve some of that?
Yes, I think our interventions have to start all the way from our lifestyle. So looking at how much you're sleeping. There's a lot of research for what our sleep habits do. So how much you're sleeping and when you're sleeping, and the exercise we're getting. If you're someone that's a chronic, so I'm a long distance runner, people that are marathon runners or that do CrossFit, those high intensity, making sure you're allowing your body adequate rest can influence your gut health. So those are simple lifestyle factors that you need to kind of go into the equation. And your stress. How can you help manage your stress so that that's not negatively influencing your gut? And then we can move on to talking about foods. And some of the foods we want to talk about are anti-inflammatory foods. So things like fatty fish, salmon, our nuts and seeds are usually anti-inflammatory for most people. And then our fruits and vegetables are going to be anti-inflammatory for most people. And then making sure you're putting in good bacteria. So good bacteria would be things like a probiotic potentially, but eating the fermented foods are even better for people that are not struggling with really bad stomach issues. I usually try and start with, let's talk about our foods and how we can make sure our foods are providing what we need. So things like yogurt or kefir, kombucha is really popular, sauerkraut or kimchi, those types of things, having them on a regular basis to introduce those good probiotics. And then some of the prebiotics, which can be some of the extra fibers that actually feed the gut bacteria. So kind of doing a little bit of a overhaul to your gut to make sure that you're getting the right food.
Thinking about like healthcare, and you mentioned that doctors do studies or they do labs or tests and then do some diagnosis, but that IBS is kind of that elimination, like you said, like we can't figure out anything else why you're having these symptoms. How do you see it affecting healthcare? Do you see this group of people who have IBS growing? Do you see it being managed better? How do you see it affecting healthcare?
I think it's definitely growing. Like I said, some of the lifestyle things that we're doing and our diet in general are not doing us any favors. So I think that's definitely growing, but also our understanding of it is growing. So it's someone that it's not uncommon. I'll meet someone that says, well, my grandparents, my grandpa always had these like stomach issues, but I didn't really ever think anything about it. So we're understanding there's a genetic component to it as well. And their grandpa might not have done any treatment for it. He just was like, oh, I would take a Gas-X, or, I'd get a little constipated and just continue on a day-by-day basis taking a laxative or something like that. So we're doing a lot more treatment methods for it. And there's just a lot more awareness to it. It seems maybe it's just me because I'm in the gut health community, but I feel like every time I turn on the TV, there is a different commercial for probiotics. Or something like that that's supposed to help with your impact your gut. So I think we're a lot more aware of it, and a lot of people are interested in it. So the marketing around it is heightened. For there's a billion probiotics. When I started as a dietitian, which is only 5 years ago, we kind of touched on probiotics in school, and I worked in my first job as a dietitian was working as a retail dietitian. We had a handful of probiotics. There was my favorite one was one that we kept behind the pharmacy counter because it was refrigerated. We didn't have a refrigerated section. Now you walk into any grocery store and there's thousands. That's usually people, I'll say, oh, make sure you get a good probiotic. Or a doctor will tell a patient, go get a good probiotic. And they come to me like, I don't even know how there's thousands. How can I possibly decide which one is a good probiotic for me and my symptoms? And it can be very daunting for patients. So I think the awareness is increasing, and we're going to see patients seeking out help, which is going to influence the ways that physicians interact with it. But I also think a big picture of it is the actual microbiome, which is all the bacteria that makes up and fungus that make up our gut tract. So as we understand that, they've just started sequencing it. So we've started having a better understanding of it, and research is coming out on a daily basis and on how we can understand that and apply that information. But I think as we continue to dig into that research, we're going to understand our gut a lot better and how it influences and how we can influence it with our the different interventions we might do. Diet, exercise, all of those things can influence it and do influence it.
I know my listeners are thinking to themselves, well, what is a good probiotic to get at the store if I don't like yogurt and kefir and kombucha and sauerkraut and kimchi?
Yeah. So there's a couple that I think are better. I think in general, the rules of thumb are it doesn't have to have thousands of different strands, but I usually like to see ones that have a couple of the lactobacillus strands and then a couple that have the bifidobacteria strands. And I think most people also benefit, especially if you have a little bit of stomach problems. If you're someone who's like, I just want a general probiotic, I don't know that there's a ton of research for people that they should have it on a daily basis for the rest of their life. Maybe that research will come out. Right now, I think making sure you have a good one that's altering your gut bacteria, because part of the problem with some probiotics is the capsule that it's put in, whether that actually can survive your stomach's acid in your stomach to make it to the GI tract, the remaining GI tract, and to proliferate your intestines. That's the whole goal. And some of them are not put in the right way that they can. So that can be very confusing for a consumer too. Sometimes the delayed release will help that a little bit, just reading that on the label. And you don't need 100 billion. You can do just I think a 10 billion would probably be fine. That's the quantity. That sounds like a lot, but a 10 billion would probably be fine. And our gut is very transient. It changes from a daily basis. So if you're someone that has a little bit of tummy troubles and you think, I just started taking a probiotic and I got sick instantly, that's a possibility. So either gradually build up to it. Don't try and take the recommended dosage of 8 in a day or something like that. Try and gradually build up to it. And that can help as well. And I actually recommend, so that the other strand that I think the lactobacillus and the bifido, I think a lot of people with stomach problems benefit from the fungal strain, which is Saccharomyces boulardii. That's I said a lot of really fun long words, but they're common ones that you can find or just walk into a good grocery store, a good and natural market that has some support. Someone that works there and say those words or Google it and Saccharomyces boulardii, and they will be able to point you in that right direction. But that's another one that has good research as far as kind of help managing some of that gut dysbiosis or that disruption in gut bacteria. So I think those are good things to look for in a probiotic. But I do recommend talking to a practitioner if you have that availability, because like I said, going into your regular grocery store and just buying one off the shelf, you have no idea if that's helping you other than how you feel. So sometimes your practitioner will have a recommendation. This one's well researched. This one's not real researched, or this one's good for people that just that have more predominant diarrhea or more predominant constipation. So there's so many different factors that they can kind of help you navigate through and make a better selection.
You mentioned some of the recent changes, like with the microbiome tracking. And what are some of the more recent advances made in the treatment of this issue? Or is there any research going on that you think is really exciting that may provide some great insight?
Well, I think one of the more interesting areas of research, I'm a gut nerd, so I think everything that has to do with the gut is super interesting. But one of the interesting pieces is that they're noticing different populations of bacteria in your gut influence the way that you absorb nutrients. So you can actually malabsorb nutrients based off the bacteria that you have predominant in your gut, which can also influence how much you can serve two people the exact same plate of food, and they can actually absorb one person over the other can absorb more of the calories and nutrients from it, which is usually more predominant in people that are overweight or obese. I think that's really interesting, just to be able to understand that it's not people who struggle to lose weight or to maintain their weight, that sometimes it's a lot deeper than just the calories that they're eating next to their skinny friends. It can be the calories. It can be actually what their gut is doing with those calories. And we have the ability to test that, but I already said the gut's very transient. So it can change and fluctuate with seasons and different times of day and all of that. We can influence that. And I think they're still trying to figure out how they can, on a population-wide, make that available and whether that information is going to be super reliable. I think that will come out soon enough that people will be able to, and there are some tests that I'll use on patients to see what the composition is of their microbiome, to understand it and see, what types of things are they going to benefit from the most, as far as which type of bacteria from a probiotic they might need, which type of foods they might benefit from, and kind of look at that whole picture, be able to see what's going on inside and why they might be having some of their symptoms that they have.
So thinking about the listeners being dietitians or even just people just more interested in nutrition, how can this information that we've talked about, what would be some key takeaways for people to use in their day-to-day life, either with patients they're working with or just with themselves?
I think for practitioners that are working with patients, being asked to ask some of those questions, especially if you're doing something that's not at all related to gut health, seeing that there's so many connections. So you're talking with someone for weight loss, or like you're talking with someone for kidney disease, asking them some of those questions just to get them aware of those issues. How are your bowel movements? They might say, fine. Well, how many times a day do you go? Is that normal for you? Just asking a couple of those questions, I think, will only expand you as a practitioner, help you understand some of the trends. So you don't even have to do the research. You'll just start to see the trends in your population on what is normal and what's not normal for bowel habits, and how that really influences how their health as a population. So I think that's a great takeaway for practitioners to apply in doing more research, because you're going to get asked about the FODMAP diet, because like I said, it seems like everyone has IBS, but there's smaller things that you can do besides applying the low FODMAP diet, depending on what people's symptoms are. So, looking at their caffeine intake, looking at if they're drinking enough water, how much soda they're drinking, if they're getting enough fruits and vegetables. That's always a really easy thing that dietitians love to talk about. Are you getting enough fruits and vegetables and fiber, good sources of fiber to continue to support your bowel health? So I think those are all, and probiotics, that's probably getting behind a good probiotic. It's impossible as practitioners or as just people wanting to improve our health. I think it's impossible for us to know every single probiotic that's out on the market, but doing a little bit of research or reaching out to a trusted resource. There's some really great dietitians that you can follow on social media, finding some good ones, or check on their website, things like that you can trust and kind of keep ahead, even if gut health is not your primary occupation like it is for me. I still feel that most of us, all of us have guts, and we need to do what we can to improve those things and keep them healthy, so that you don't end up at my door saying, I need help. I want to prevent you from getting there. I want you to be able to have the resources to stay healthy. So trying to incorporate your fermented foods when you can, and exercising and getting enough sleep, simple things that you don't have to really even see a dietitian to know that you need to do, but being consistent in that will only improve your gut health for a long term.
Are there a couple dietitians that you follow that talk about gut health a lot that you would recommend?
So there's two, at least on the FODMAP side, there's two dietitians that I think are kind of the predominant ones in the U.S., and that's Patsy Katsos and Kate Scarlatta. They're both, they have written books about FODMAP. They're great resources. Kind of how I got my start with FODMAP was with both of their resources. And they both have lots of great resources on their website that are for free. So if you're someone that wants to read some more about it, if you think I've got tummy troubles, is FODMAP a good solution for me? You can go on their websites and get good resources from that. And just in social media, they both have some in that world, that realm. I also really like Andrea Hardy. She is from Canada, and she has lots of great, from the social media side, she has lots of great resources for gut health. So she does FODMAP, but she also does a lot of other areas of just gut health. So she's a fun one to follow too.
So you said Patsy
Katsos, Catsos.
Okay. And who was the other one?
Kate Scarlatta. It's Scarlata, I think.
Okay.
Close to that, at least.
Yeah, that's good. So if people are interested in learning a little bit more about it, they can also get that information from a qualified source. I always ask my guests, what is their favorite food? So what's your favorite food?
I know, like, my husband was here, he would say my answer, and this is probably like a special occasion favorite food, and this is totally a dietitian answer. I don't really know why this is my favorite food, but I love salmon salads. I know that sounds like a dietitian answer, and I don't mean it to be, but if I go out for a special, I think because I don't prepare it at home. I have a family of picky eaters, So we don't ever eat salads. We do occasionally eat salmon, but if we eat a salad, I'm eating it alone because my family will not eat it. I love to go out and get a really good salad. Not a low-calorie salad. I don't care about that. I just want a really good salad that's fresh and has lots of fun ingredients in it. I just love fun food. I think food's fun. I like to experiment with it. I like to go fun places and try new things.
I love salads too. I know.
Such a dietitian answer, but the truth, we can't help it. It makes our bodies feel good. That intuitive side to it too, where we know the foods that make us feel good. And that's, I like to have a brownie every once in a while too, but salad makes me feel good and it tastes good.
Great. Bethany, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It was a pleasure to have you on the show. I know my listeners have learned a lot about gut health and IBS and how that can affect them even, or just like a friend if they know somebody, hey, this is what I heard about that. So if listeners want to connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
So I'd love to connect with you on social media. You can find me on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. It's at the KC, so like Kansas City Dietitian. Dietitian is spelled Dietitan, so with 2 T's. Or my website is kansascitydietitian.com.
Great. So guys, it's been another great episode of Nutrition Experts Podcast, the podcast that is all about learning more so you can do more with nutrition in your life.
You've just listened to an episode of the Nutrition Experts Podcast. Be sure to get more information about this week's episode at www.nutritionexpertspodcast.com. Tune in next time for another great conversation with a nutrition expert and expand your personal knowledge in the field of nutrition, one conversation at a time.